Thank you so much. My first apology is that I have to stand up when I speak. And I think it has something to do with what Al Gore would have described as a recovering politician when you're of a particular height. So when we first came to power in South Africa as the ANC, our first trip abroad was to Atlanta, Georgia, home place of Martin Luther King Jr. And when we arrived at Atlanta Airport, which I didn't realize was the home of the Coca-Cola Corporation, we were greeted by the mayor of Atlanta, who was a former professional basketball player. And to someone of my height, he seemed to be about 7'10". And he welcomed us from a lectern that was an illuminated Coke can. And when he had finished, my boss, who was a guy called Tokyo Sexwale, who was premier of the Gauteng province, said to me, "Andrew, you just go and respond. I'm too tired." So I walked up behind this Coke can and I said a few words, and I went back down to Tokyo, who I hadn't worked with for very long by then. So I said to him, "Chief, was that okay?" And he sort of looked at me and he said, "What you said was fine. It's just a shame that all we could see was a very sweaty bald head sticking out of an illuminated Coke can." So I do have an aversion to speaking behind anything. Let me say it's a great honor to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. And I must again apologize up front that I can't stay very long. I was hoping to spend most of today with you, but unfortunately at a rally outside the Israeli ambassador's house last night, 2 people were arrested under the Terrorism Act, one of whom is a 79-year-old Israeli Jewish academic who is not in the best of health. So I have promised that I will get back to London as soon as possible and go to Charing Cross police station where they're being held. But I do apologize for that. And my final apology, well, I hope it's my final apology, but I can't guarantee it, is I'm going to address the topic that I've been asked to speak about in a very personal way. So you might hear things about my life that are of absolutely no interest to you, but I hope you will understand why I've chosen this approach to address the subject that I've been asked to speak about. So my mother was Austrian. She was Jewish. She survived the Holocaust in Vienna itself. She was hidden for 3.5 years in a coal cellar. And whenever there was a raid in the area by the SS or the Gestapo, she would be rolled up in a carpet, and the carpet would be pushed up against the wall, and coal would be placed around the carpet, so that if any of the soldiers managed to get into the cellar, they would hopefully not see her. They never did, and there are still bullets in the door leading to the coal cellar that I took my children to see fairly recently. The reason I tell you this is not only because she lost dozens of her family, primarily at Auschwitz, where I've lectured for the Auschwitz Institute on genocide prevention, but also because when she met my father, who was South African, in London, and they went back to South Africa after marrying, my mother very quickly came to the opinion that the majority of South Africans were being treated like the Jews of Europe had been treated. And for her, never again meant for all humanity. It was never just about Jews. As a consequence of which, she got involved in the anti-apartheid struggle through an organization called the Black Sash, an extraordinary organization of white women who would protest against the worst iniquities of the apartheid system. So I suppose, I would spend my school holidays illegally going into townships with her. And so I grew up understanding that the system under which we lived, in which myself and my family were obviously incredibly privileged, was iniquitous and wrong. I continued my political involvement, And then in my late teens, when I was a university student running a welfare agency in squatter camps and townships around Cape Town where I studied, without even realizing it, I was recruited into the ANC. I was invited to a meeting when there was a huge crisis in a squatter settlement called Crossroads, where 70,000 shacks had been burned to the ground, and 178 people burned alive in those shacks. And I was invited to this meeting by a prominent activist in the area, and I didn't even realize that it was an ANC underground cell. It was only retrospectively, because they sort of didn't give you forms to fill in. And once you'd been invited to such a meeting, you were recruited. And that's sort of the way the ANC functioned even when we were in government. I was first elected to the Gauteng legislature after our first democratic elections in 1994. And I played all sorts of unconstitutional roles. I chaired the Finance and Economics Committee in the legislature, but I also acted as economic advisor to the Premier and the Finance Minister, who we were supposed to be conducting oversight over. And I set up and ran the Treasury and the Economics Department, because we had very few people with economic and financial experience. And for my sins, in this role, I would often have to go to the World Economic Forum at Davos whenever Tokyo or our finance minister had to give a talk there. And I was there in 1995, and Tokyo and I get called to see the president. Now, Mr. Mandela was in a tiny hotel room, and he was sitting on his bed in yellow pajamas, which is quite disarming. And he chatted to Tokyo, and then he turned to me and he said, "So, Andrew, how do you feel about moving to Parliament in Cape Town?" And I said, "Well, sir, I'm originally from Cape Town, but my partner has a job in Johannesburg, so I'd need to consult her." He and Tokyo carried on talking, and as we were leaving his room, he said, "It's a good thing you're okay to go to Cape Town, because you're being sworn in Parliament on Tuesday. I was only due back in the country on the Thursday." But that's pretty much the way things worked in the ANC. I'd had to leave the country at very short notice in 1986 to avoid serving in the apartheid military, and I'll come back to that a little later. I returned to the country when the ANC was unbanned and worked as a facilitator in our constitutional negotiations that led to the 94 elections. Being an MP during that period was extraordinary. For the first 4 years of our democracy, we showed the world that there is another way to do politics. Everything was done in the national interest. It wasn't about ensuring power for the ANC. It wasn't about ensuring that Nelson Mandela would be a president for life, because he'd already announced he would only serve one term. It was about what was best for the majority of people of the country. That changed very quickly. As Mandela stepped down, so his successor, Thabo Mbeki, very quickly adopted the very tawdry global norms of politics and economics. And that manifested in an arms deal in which we spent $43 billion on weapons, pounds, that we had absolutely no need for, and that we've barely used until today. And this was at a time, we didn't spend, I'm thinking of another deal now, we spent $10 billion on the weapons. And this was at a time when Mbeki was saying to the 6 million South Africans living with HIV or AIDS that we had no money to provide antiretrovirals that would keep them alive, because he was an AIDS denialist. That policy choice between the weapons and the medication led conservatively, according to Harvard University, to the avoidable deaths of 355,000 South Africans over those 5 years. 35,000 babies a year were born HIV positive because we couldn't afford mother-to-child transmission treatment, but we could afford to spend $10 billion on weapons we didn't need. Why? Because $365 million of bribes were paid. And I discovered, as I started investigating this case, that as far back as our constitutional negotiations, there'd been executives from the world's biggest arms companies talking to Mbeki, who they knew would effectively be Mandela's prime minister, to Joe Modise, who they knew would be our first democratic defense minister. And they would say to them, not only is this a great way to keep the white generals happy because they don't like the idea of democracy, you give them toys to play with, but it's also the way that many political parties around the world are funded. And that's crucial to an understanding of the global arms trade. So I wrote my first book, a book called After the Party, on the way in which the arms trade corrupted our nascent democracy in South Africa. But we assumed at the time that we had just been naive and stupid. Here we were, a bunch of activists who suddenly were forming a government with very limited skills of governance. And as I started inquiring and investigating further to understand companies that paid £115 million in bribes to win one deal, like BAE Systems, I realized that what happened in South Africa is happening all over the world all the time. When Tony Blair came to South Africa to negotiate the bribes for BAE Systems in our arms deal, he was at the same time doing the same thing in 7 other countries, with BAE, with the help of the British government, paying over £1 billion of bribes on those deals in that moment. Because the reality is that the trade in weapons is the most deadly, the most corrupt, and the least regulated trade on the planet. As Amnesty International say, the trade in weapons is regulated less than the global trade in bananas. Now, I don't know which you think are more dangerous. The trade in weapons accounts for 40% of all corruption in all global trade, 40%. And what is absolutely crucial to understand is that some of those bribes oil the wheels of our political systems. So, when Britain concludes a £43 billion, that's where I had the number from, a £43 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia, paying 6 billion, that's with a B, 6 billion pounds of bribes, primarily to the Saudi royal family, but also to numerous intermediaries or arms dealers. Some of that money comes back to Britain in what we call the feedback principle. So that the chief executive, the executive chairman of BAE Systems at the time, Sir Richard Evans, was given an apartment in Mayfair in central London worth £6.5 million in 1986. I shudder to think what it's worth today. Mark Thatcher, the son of the then Prime Minister, is given £12 million because his mother doesn't want to have to fund her wastrel son for the rest of her life. And the main arms dealer, who is a pillar of the British establishment and after whom the Oxford Business School is named, gives huge amounts of money to thousands of individuals on the understanding that they will donate that money to the Conservative Party. And Margaret Thatcher, of course, described Tony Blair as her greatest political achievement because he turned the Labour Party into a neoliberal, warmongering party. And so in the arms deals that he did, like in my own country, the Labour Party started getting these donations. And since leaving office, Tony Blair, conservatively, has made £110 million personally from the companies who benefited from the invasion of Iraq and from his association with BAE Systems and other British arms companies. That is how the global trade in weapons uses our tax pounds, not only to spread conflict across the world, but to corrupt our own political system. Now, the arms trade affects all aspects of our world. The most profound way in which it does this is through the creation of what the American philosopher C. Wright Mills describes as the military metaphysic, where we see the world through a military lens. So we declare wars on everything, not just on people and countries, but on obesity. We declare wars on drugs. And what that does is it ensures that our politicians and the executives of these companies and our media, who are often owned by the same financial institutions that are heavily invested in the defense companies, promote conflict rather than diplomacy as the solution to differences. Today, the world's most militarily powerful country, the United States of America, employs more people to run one aircraft carrier than it has diplomats across the entire world. And America today has 12 aircraft carriers. That is where its priorities lie. But it also has massive impacts, not just on foreign policy, on defense and national security policy, but on our economic and financial policies. In the budget this week, despite the fact that Britain has more billionaires than at any time in this country's history, while at the same time we have more families having to use food banks to feed themselves than at any time since the end of the Second World War, a Labour government has just announced a £3 billion increase in defence spending and unlimited resources to support Ukraine. These are the ways in which the military metaphysic affects our world. Now, as we complain about the £3 billion increase, it's important to note that yesterday Israel announced a 63% increase in its defense budget. The previous largest annual increase in a defense budget in human history was 14%. But for the financial year 2025-2026, Israel's defense budget will go up by 63% to, in the words of the budget document, intensify the conflict with the terrorists around us. Now, Israel plays a unique and crucial role in the global arms trade. There is an extraordinary book that I would encourage you to read by a guy called Anthony Lowenstein called The Palestine Laboratory, which documents how Israel uses the occupied Palestinian territories as a laboratory for weapons, many of them illegal. Palestinian people are seen as nothing more than guinea pigs. And the countries of the West, including the United States, Britain, and Germany, use Israel's R&D to test their own weapons, some of which are banned by international treaties. But in addition to that, Israel acts as a shop window, not only for its own ever more advanced weaponry and technology, but for that of the West as well. After every incursion into the occupied territories, Israel holds a clandestine arms fair at which it boasts about the performance of various Western and Israeli weaponry in those occupied territories. Let me be clear. I am white. I am Jewish. I experienced nothing but privilege growing up in an apartheid system. So I'm not going to give you my opinion on Israel. I'm going to give you the opinion of my political mentors who experienced the reality of apartheid in a way that I never did. Both Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who I was incredibly privileged to call a friend, described Israel as an apartheid state, but went further. They said the apartheid practiced in Israel is far, far more efficient, more brutal, and more deadly than the apartheid practiced in South Africa. Why? Because of one fundamental difference between the systems, and there are many parallels. The South African situation and the Israeli situation are both a consequence of European settler colonialism. They have similar roots. I would argue, along with that settler colonialism, is embedded racist white supremacy. And we would not be seeing what we are seeing in Gaza today without that white supremacy having taken hold, not just in Israel, but in the countries of the Western world, so-called. So why did they describe Israel as more brutal? Because unlike apartheid South Africa, whose economy was entirely dependent on a huge black labor force earning slave wages to do the most dangerous, difficult work, extracting our mineral wealth from the deep mines, Israel's economy is not dependent on the Palestinian people. The South African apartheid regime could simply not afford to massacre tens, if not hundreds of thousands of its people, because the economic cost of retraining those workers would have put too much burden on the country's economies and on the sacred profit margins of its companies. Given my mother's history, I understand why Jews felt the need for a safe haven after the Second World War. A cousin of my mother, who was liberated from a camp at age 15, who still, at the age of 94, has her striped pajamas where she lives in Washington, D.C. today, made her way to Palestine, assuming that her entire family had been murdered. She discovered her father had survived, and he too had made his way to Palestine, and they were reunited. So you can understand that imperative. That did not give Britain the right to gift Israel the land of Palestine, which was described as a land with no people for a people with no land. As we all know, it was nothing of the sort. Israel was built on the homes, the bodies, and the graves of the Palestinian people. And as I grew up in the ANC, I was taught very quickly, not the liberal Zionism of my parents, but the fraternal nature of the Palestinian struggle for liberation with our struggle in South Africa. It is astonishing to me that a people, like the Jewish people of which I am part, who have suffered the amount of suffering over thousands of years that we have, were completely oblivious to the appalling suffering that encompassed the Nakba. I simply do not understand it psychologically. I understand it politically. It's called imperialism. But I don't understand it psychologically. The fact that you are a victim of a Holocaust does not give you the right to oppress another people and in the process to commit the world's first live-streamed genocide. Because that's what we're witnessing today and for the last year. And of course, it didn't start a year ago. And it's not that our governments are doing nothing about it. Our governments are consciously and explicitly not just enabling and facilitating this genocide, they are profiting from it. The Financial Times a few weeks ago had a celebratory headline: £52 billion bonanza for arms companies, joyously announcing that because Benjamin Netanyahu had stated this war, and it's no war, it is a genocide, this war has at least 18 months to run. And we saw that in their budget of earlier this week. That is good news. Our world has gone mad. I'm writing a book at the moment called Making a Killing: How the West Profits from the Slaughter in Gaza and Yemen. When I finish this book, I'm planning to write a very short, very simple book, simply called The Madness of the Moment. Because this post-truth world in which we live has turned meaning and language upside down. War is peace. Escalation is de-escalation. The racists call the lifelong anti-racists anti-Semitic, while denying their own racism. For my sins, I have 3 degrees in clinical psychology. I did those degrees before I started studying economics and finance. It was the only way I could stay out of the apartheid military. I have never in my 60 years felt such a need to utilize that training as I do today. Our senior political leaders and our senior corporate leaders are at best sociopaths who cannot acknowledge the indescribable suffering that their decisions and policies are causing hundreds of thousands of people around the world. And what we are seeing, in order to defend Israel and its genocide, we are seeing the edifice of the international rule of law that was created in the wake of the Holocaust of the Second World War rent asunder. We are seeing any vestige of arms export control laws and regulations stamped upon to allow the state of Israel to do whatever it wants to do. And this comes within the context of a global climate of extreme ethno-nationalism. And for me, herein lies the apex of this madness. Today, Israel will call whoever criticizes it anti-Semitic, uncivilized, inhuman, in language that reminds me so much of the apartheid-era language of how the apartheid state described the United Nations, the outside world, who didn't understand that we were saving Christianity for humanity. But who are Israel's greatest allies? Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, who uses the Hohenheim imagery of the rich Jew with the huge nose that was used by the Nazis. He uses that every time he has to fight an election. And who gave him that strategy? 2 Jewish political consultants from New York City. And then we have Prime Minister Modi, whose entire philosophy through the RSS movement is based on racism and anti-Semitism. And these people are welcomed in Israel with full state honors every 6 months. And the madness of this came home to me a couple of years ago when Donald Trump's supporters occupied the Capitol. And there was this huge guy in one of the photographs with a T-shirt. 6 million was not enough. And a photograph of the gate of Auschwitz. Arbeit macht frei. Work makes free. And next to him was standing a fellow insurrectionist holding the Israeli flag. And they couldn't see the contradiction between those two things. So, in the few minutes I have left, where to from here? Benjamin Netanyahu will continue this genocide for as long as his Western allies allow him to. Why? Because when it ends, he not only loses power, but he goes to jail, not for the genocide, but for his myriad corruption in office over his first 5 administrations. There are 13 arms deals, most of them conducted between Israel and Germany, Germany being a country that is experiencing its own national psychosis. The bribes paid to Netanyahu go through the German arms company's agents. The main agent just happens to be Netanyahu's own legal advisor, who usefully is also his first cousin. Because when you are talking about bribes in the billions like these deals involve, it's best to keep it in the family. I had a conversation the other night with a liberal Zionist who has served the Israeli, he's now retired, who has served the Israeli state for 35 years. As you can imagine, our politics are somewhat different. But this person said to me, my country, Israel, has become a country of rabid, bloodthirsty dogs, where we need the taste of blood every minute of every day. And he said, therein lies the destruction of the state of Israel. Now, unless there is a full reckoning, unless there is justice for the tens, if not hundreds of thousands who have been murdered, the rule of law in this world is finished. So that when Keir Starmer, my esteemed local member of parliament, announces that he will spend whatever Ukraine needs of our money to defend them from what I believe is an illegal invasion by Russia, and we can talk about that more if you want to. People will hear that and laugh at him, because he and other Western leaders have absolutely no basis on which to talk about legal and illegal conflicts, in which to talk about a rule of law, in which to talk about who is and isn't terrorists. Because today, as happened last night, we are seeing journalists, climate activists, pro-Palestinian activists being charged under the Terrorism Act. Keir Starmer is instinctively undemocratic and authoritarian. And the message that we, the people of his constituency, sent to him last night is that people who oppose genocide, who oppose climate catastrophe are not the terrorists. The terrorists are those people perpetrating genocide and those like you enabling, facilitating, and profiting from that genocide. But let me end in a more hopeful place. When I left South Africa in 1986, at 48 hours' notice, I couldn't even tell my family I was leaving the country. And I was a kid. I was 21 years old. The night before I left, I sat on a hill above Cape Town and was in floods of tears looking at my incredibly beautiful home city, because I believed I would never again be able to set foot in the country of my birth. 4 years later, the ANC was unbanned, our political prisoners were released, and all the exiles could return home. A further 4 years after that, Nelson Mandela became our first ever democratically elected president. 8 years from the moment that it felt like we were at our darkest, darkest nadir, where the apartheid military state felt so powerful, was getting so much covert support from the British and the Americans. 8 years after that, we were a democracy. From the bleakest darkness emerges the light. And as surely as South Africa was liberated from apartheid, so too will Palestine be liberated. Because, as Nelson Mandela said, after 27 years in an apartheid prison, our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for this very fiery intervention. I'll go straight to Rania.
Okay, I'm just going to put a stopwatch because I get less time, but that's fine because I would like more discussion. So I give myself the 20 minutes. So thank you, Andrew. I loved everything you said because it's really, we need to talk about why and what's going on and how to go forward. But unlike Andrew, I'm going to make no apologies because I'm sick and tired of making apologies. Okay, so I make no apology about making no apology. I make no apology for this being very personal. I'm Lebanese. I have Palestinian nieces and nephews. And I make no apologies for maybe some strong language I might use, because frankly, after tens of thousands of people dead, after Gaza erased, after Lebanon being decimated, there's no apologies needed. Okay? I'm not condemning Hamas, I'm not condemning Hezbollah, I'm not condemning resistance. I make no apologies for that. Doesn't mean I agree with them, but that's another story. We are here because of Palestine, because of the genocide and now what's happening in Lebanon, but we can add to it Yemen. We can add to it another tragedy that's been unfolding in Sudan that's been completely missed because it's the same people playing the same games that Andrew so eloquently talked about. And I want to read your book. I want to learn it by heart because I know this. I've been telling people, cherchez la monnaie, that, look for the money, look where it is. But so before we do any of that, I want to ask you all for something. I want to bring those people into the room with us. So if you're a Muslim, you can say Al-Fatiha. If you're a Christian, you can say the Lord's Prayer. If you are any other faith. So please take some time to remember all those who have perished in the most cruel way. And let's just bring them into the room and make Al-Fatiha for them. Jazakumullah kulla khair. So today is a very important day, and I'll tell you why. Today, on the 2nd of November, is the 107th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. Or, as we say, call it in Arabic, the Balfour Promise, because it promised our land, our history, our geography, our culture to somebody else, regardless of that. So where are we at in terms of 107 years later? Recently, I was doing, I'm not a historian, but so I know some wonderful historians in the room. I was writing a chapter on the history of higher education in Lebanon, and one of the interesting things that I discovered was that from the moment of the Balfour Declaration, the students at the American University of Beirut annually would go on a strike and will hold a demonstration and will go out in the streets of Beirut to mark the tragedy of the Balfour Promise. And I had no idea about that actually from that moment, the people in the Arab world, and they were still, at the time, remember, still under, I think, to start with Ottoman rule, and then moved on to the European colonial rule. So moving that, they realized what a tragedy that was for us. And at the American University of Beirut, no less, which was actually a crucible of Arab nationalism and discussions around that, students would hold an annual strike. So the people of the region knew from the start what this meant for us in the region. And we're talking about the geopolitical kind of architecture, and you know, Andrew talked very eloquently about the players, but can we go back a little bit, because sometimes we talk about Lebanon or Palestine or Syria, and I'm not saying we were not nation states, but we did move from one kind of form of being an empire, so kind of a broad colonization, let's say, but into another form of created nation states, and into this pain of trying to figure out a national identity within terminology and parameters handed down to us. And again, in the same note, I will not condemn the Muslim Brotherhood, because in the 19th century, it was their way of, actually early 19th century, it was a way of thinking, as the Ottoman Empire disintegrates, who are we? Where do we find our national identity? And the Brotherhood talked yesterday about all the kind of messianic fervor around the world. I think it is there, and back to your psychoanalysis, I think there is a crisis of national identities for a lot of people. I think it's across the board. It manifests itself as racism, as kind of hating the others, or the immigrants, the word immigrant now, the small boats, oh my God, you know, it's just, it goes to the extreme of genocide. So I think there are many issues I think we need to look at, and one of them is that idea of national identity. How do we define it? I know with the Muslim Institute, and yesterday we were talking about Islam and Judaism, but the issue of Israel, the issue of the Levant, the issue of internal politics of Lebanon, which are still ongoing. You know, we are a failed state at the best of times in Lebanon, but we had an 18 years of a war, and part of it is external forces, but a lot of it is also this struggle for finding out what is our national identity. At the start of the civil war in Lebanon, when the different groups were putting up the roadblocks, they would stop somebody and say, you know, this was the joke, I don't know if it happened or not, but it's like, they want to know if you're Palestinian or Lebanese. And a Palestinian would be stopped, and it would be the Phalange, and I grew up in a Phalange stronghold. And they would say, and he'd say, I'm Christian like you. And they would say, but your Christ is Palestinian. Take him away. I mean, that was, it happened. Don't forget who committed the Sabra and Shatila massacres. It was the Phalange. It was us, the Lebanese, with the Israelis allowing them in. Netanyahu was trying to play the same game. And when Nasrallah was assassinated, I'm the support of Hezbollah. Politically, I stand in opposition internally in Lebanon, but my first worry was the civil war in Lebanon. And I thought, at least, he always promised there will never be civil war coming back to Lebanon. But again, this is another story, but it's part of the complex geopolitical picture, the complex geopolitical architecture. But let's come back to England. So another personal little note, beside the fact that I am Lebanese, and I'm trying to very much to, don't know if you can feel it, to hold my emotions back, because I get very emotional, and I couldn't even prepare anything, because how can I prepare it when my country is being bombed every day and my people are being killed, plus everything else. I kind of, so I got the email about this, and I said to Hassan, "You're not talking about Lebanon, please talk about Lebanon." He said, "Come and talk." And I had to write a little biography, and I always used to refer to myself, after 42 years in England, as a British Lebanese, or a Lebanese Londoner. And I couldn't bring myself to write the word British anymore. I am no longer British. I have a British passport. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to use it. But I'm Lebanese. I'm an Arab. I've given up. I've never felt less British, less European, less Western than now. I think the demarcations line are down the ground. And again, I make no apology for that. I think what we have witnessed, and it's not just as Muslims, I'm going to bring that term, is the anti-Arab anti-Semitism. So it's a form of racism that's actually anti-Semitic, but the Jews have now they've gone from being the blacks of Europe to being now honorary whites, because it serves the purpose of the people that Andrew talked about. It serves that purpose. That's why they can wear a T-shirt saying 6 million wasn't enough and hold an Israeli flag. It's weird, but that's how they do it. The Zionists actually have been co-opted as the new whites, because now we are the blacks again. And that means that when the BBC reports, not even on Gaza, on Lebanon, I haven't been even listening for a year, but sometimes for my sins I put Radio 4 on. And I wanted to know how they're reporting about Lebanon, and it'll be from the perpetrator's perspective. Israel today said it targeted something to do with Hezbollah. I'm just, excuse me? Would you say the rapist said, "I raped her because she was wearing a short skirt"? This is almost the same thing. 2 days ago, put the radio on in the car, Radio 4 News, 7 civilians died in northern Israel. Tragedy. But what about, I don't know, the 7,000, 70,000? So I bring it back to the narrative. So there is an interesting thing in that we're here talking, and we need to take it out. And I know that Andrew, in his political work, is doing that. I'm an academic. Maybe I do it through academia. I need to do more. We all need to do more. But we know what the narrative is like. We know it's dehumanization. We know it's gaslighting. We know all of that. Now, how do you counteract it? Where is it we have the spaces to counteract this narrative? We can't change the geopolitics. We need to understand them, and that's why I really thank Andrew for what he just told us, because he really gave us all the details that we can use in actually constructing the narrative and explaining what's going on. But it's back to where actually can we find the spaces to put forward our own narrative. Because, for instance, one of the things that Andrew mentioned, the use of the anti-terrorism law, which has been beyond misuse, because now all you have to say is Hamas or Hezbollah, and there's no argument. It's almost like you can't argue back now. Although we're targeting, I actually was in Korea recently, and I was talking to an English person who's the Washington Times correspondent there, and I mentioned that my cousin's house was bombed by Israel. She happens to have brain cancer, and because of her brain cancer, she's married, she has a little daughter, she's staying with her mom so they can look after the daughter, so luckily there was nobody in the house. And he said to me, why was she involved with Hezbollah? Imagine. I'm saying to somebody, my cousin's house was bombed in Beirut, in Lebanon. And he said that was Lebanon. And he said, was she involved with Hezbollah? Was it near Hezbollah? As if that justifies it. This is the interesting, as if that justifies it. After the pager attack, it was celebrated in the US. They actually celebrated a terrorist attack. It was at the head of Shin Bet who actually said that was a terrorist attack. That was celebrated. So there is something about that narrative, and I'm really worried about that colleague, because I hope it's not my colleague Chaim. It's Chaim Rashish. Oh my God. So a dear friend, a very dear friend and colleague. He is so outspoken. He's so outspoken. We'll talk about that later. We also lost another wonderful 2 days ago friend and a anti-Zionist Jewish person. My first, John Rose, if anybody knew John Rose, he wrote The Myth of Zionism. He died 2 days ago as well. So yeah, John Rose died. You didn't know he died? Yeah, 2 days ago. So 2 days ago, John Rose passed away after an illness. And he was one of my first Jewish anti-Zionists I was privileged to work with and meet and learn from. So coming back to what are we doing here? One of the things, this is where, if you are a bit sensitive, close your ears. Because one of the things I've been very, very angry with, and particularly with a lot of ex-friends from political circles, is that kind of the use of what's going on as a forum for what I call intellectual masturbation. Is that idea we're going to discuss these things because somehow it makes us look really intelligent? No, this is gone. We don't do that anymore. We discuss it to try and understand how we can counteract it. I don't have answers, so I'm going to soon leave it to you to give me the answers, because I would like to know how we go forward. I would like to know how maybe, we talked earlier about academia. I am so ashamed of academia in the UK. Because when I said to our Vice-Chancellor, we had a meeting with her, kind of quite early, January, I think, and by then they hadn't destroyed all the universities in Gaza, but they had killed 2 Vice-Chancellors and all their families that I knew of, besides a lot of deans and teachers. And I said, universities should speak up. There are 2 Vice-Chancellors and their families who've been murdered, and several universities at the time attacked. And she promised she would go to Universities UK, which she did, to her credit. And whoever the woman is, I can't remember, said, we're not saying anything about this. And the answer was, we can't take sides. And I said, would you have said the same thing about apartheid South Africa? And I said, you don't need to answer this. It's a rhetorical question. And she said, it's an interesting question. There was no answer. So what we have seen is institutions. So where do we go from here? Institutionally, whether it's the government, the mainstream media, I'm talking about the UK just, I can't even go to the US. Institutions like universities have either remained silent or actively tried to silence voices, actively tried to criminalize people, actively try to dehumanize and gaslight. So where are the spaces where we can counteract that? I don't have answers. I'm hoping you will have some answers. But also, how can we then try and avoid this threat? It's the kind of danger of becoming intellectual masturbation, as I say, and move it into action. How can we break down the barriers between where we are here and outside? I don't want us always to preach to the converted. We know that they are the converted, and we might, and between us we can have some maybe difficult discussions because we might disagree on tactics or whatever. But we need to go beyond, and I know there are some people we can't reach. So where is that room for maneuver? It could be through boycott. I know we're doing BDS, but how can we do BDS when what kept Israel's economy going in the last year was with the trade with the UAE, Turkey, and Morocco? How can we do? I actually, at the beginning of the genocide, I floated the idea with some friends of boycotting Hajj and Umrah. And so, astaghfirullah, I can say that. This is ibadah. I'm just like, I don't think God really is concerned about you going to Hajj and Umrah right now, given there are people being genocided. Seriously? I actually would like to float. Imagine if all the Muslims in the world said, we're not going to Hajj and Umrah. There you go. It's going to be empty until you do something. So there is this, again, back to being Muslims and being here. It's that kind of demarcation in between, I've got the stopwatch, between, oh, this is religion, so we don't touch it. Well, I always said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cares more probably about the little toe of a little child in Gaza more than the Kaaba itself. Let's be honest. This is what Islam is about. It's not about a pile of stones. You can't tell me, this is ibadah, let's not talk about it. So I think we need to think about, maybe we can together do it. How do we go forward? How do we challenge the narrative? How do we reclaim the narrative? Where do we do it? Where are the spaces do we do it? And when we are faced with the idea that somehow this is a Muslim-Jewish thing, and I always say it's nothing to do with Muslims and Jews, but there is this narrative. How do we talk to colleagues who are still working at, oh, we need to rebuild this Muslim-Jewish thing, by actually saying, is there a danger by focusing on this, that we actually take the focus away from fascism, from imperialism, from what all the weapons are doing, from the fact that, again, I make no apology, I'll probably be banned from Saudi and the UAE, although my son lives there, my brother and sister. This has been financed by places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Make no. Yeah. I'm sure that Andrew will probably have all the details. He can probably tell us. But I can see it, I can feel it, I know what's going on. So back to Palestine. We kept saying all eyes on, and even when we had all eyes on, it was almost like, despite all of that, they went ahead and they did it, and they said we can do more. And we're seeing this in Lebanon as well. They went into the south of Lebanon and they literally used the scorched earth policy. They literally used phosphorus, white phosphorus, because it kills the soil for 5 years. And the south of Lebanon is the breadbasket of Lebanon. But they've done something similar before, and there's an article from The Economist from 1998, it's again about around the 2nd of November or the 8th of November, where actually when Israel was for 30 years occupying the south of Lebanon, they actually had companies go in and steal the soil. You can look it up, it's an article in The Economist from November 1998. They literally physically stole the soil. So again, I would open it to you now, is how do we go forward? We haven't been able to save one life in Gaza in terms of when they want to go in, what the horrors of Gaza, and they will be documented. So maybe we need to go forward with many ways. Maybe we need to officially document what's going on. So we do have for future generations. We need to create more public spaces, that's what I think, where more people are engaged in this discussion. We need to reclaim the narrative. We need to say, no, you are showing it from a perpetrator's perspective. We need to oppose more effectively, maybe learn, somebody has said yesterday, learn from the climate activists. How do we oppose the BAC system and others? By the way, BAE Systems has a whole area in Saudi that's BAE area, including beautiful beaches, by the way. I had an ex-colleague who went there on holiday and was posting. I'm like, wow, this is really great. I had no idea. And that was quite an eye-opening. I didn't even know they had that, but anyway. How can we do all of that and also build solidarity? So when one of us is attacked by the state, who do we go to? So I think there are loads of questions here. But coming back to the fact that let's not forget that this is ongoing. It hasn't stopped. I know that Andrew finished with this lovely vision of what happened in apartheid South Africa, when it actually, within 8 years, you had democracy and freedom. And I've been saying this for over a year. The Palestinians have many Mandelas. We're yet to see is an Israeli de Klerk. And it's not just for us in Palestine and Lebanon and Syria and the Levant, to figure out who we are. It's also for those hapless people in Israel, for the Israeli people who have been literally, I think, psychologically abused by Zionism, to give them that psychosis. I think I would like to save them as much as I would like to save everybody in the region. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.